Hello, I'm going to get started on October's NFL Public Forum resolution today, and the topic for October is Resolved. Developed countries have a moral obligation to mitigate the effects of climate change. Typically, October's PF resolution for the past several years has mirrored the policy resolution in some ways. This year's policy resolution is about transportation infrastructure, but most of the affirmatives on the policy topic end up running some kind of advantage that says the purpose of the transportation infrastructure is to mitigate the effects of climate change. It has a warming advantage in policy parlance. That means there's going to be a fair deal of crossover still, just not in the actual wording of the topic itself. So let's break down this topic word by word, look at what each team wants to do, look at some of the common arguments you'll see, and look at some of the strategic choices that pro and con teams are going to have to make early in rounds or in case writing. So the first couple words that jump out from the topic are just developed countries. What does that actually mean? First world and third world are not terms that really have any meaningful definition to them. Some teams will try and use that because it lets them recycle evidence from the failed states topic. That's probably not a good idea. There's a few different ways you can define developed countries, but generally speaking, they're going to be countries that have fairly large economies, export a lot of finished things, import a lot of unfinished things, so on and so forth. A lot of international economists break economies down into four phases. There are primary economies, secondary economies, tertiary economies, and quaternary economies. A primary economy is a country that just exports raw materials and imports finished goods, whether it's lumber, whether it's minerals, whatever. Those are definitely developing countries, not developed countries. Secondary economies could be either. They're countries that import things, make things out of them, and then sell those things to other countries as the primary focus of their economy. They've got a large manufacturing base. The US used to be a secondary economy, but it's probably more of a tertiary economy now. A tertiary economy is first and foremost a services economy. It's an economy that deals with getting other people the kind of things they need that secondary economies make, acting as an intermediary between other secondary economies, so on and so forth. A tertiary economy is almost definitely a developed country, and the vast majority of Europe, the United States, Canada, etc., are going to fall into that category. Quaternary economies are very few and far between, are definitely developed countries who probably don't play too much of a role in this resolution. Those would be places like Liechtenstein or Israel, for instance, and tend to act as intermediaries between tertiary economies and kind of have meta services they offer. Secondary or tertiary is probably where the line will be drawn for developed countries. Again, you want to find something that defines it in context. Maybe a developed country is a country that did a lot of polluting in the past and is now getting the benefits from having fully industrialized before. Maybe a developed country is a country that has the ability to mitigate climate change. Maybe a developed country is a country that produces a certain amount of carbon emissions per person. There's a lot of things that you could define developed countries as, but you want to look at what the literature of the topic talks about them as. What does the Kyoto Protocol think a developed country is? What does the IPCC think a developed country is? Those are probably where you want to look for that. Next, we want to look at moral obligation. Not just obligation, but moral obligation. This can be distinct from an ethical obligation. This can be distinct from a practical obligation. A moral obligation is probably some kind of prior obligation that you have because you have it. Is a deontological obligation in most cases is an obligation that doesn't come from some benefit you get from it, but simply comes from it being the right thing to do. This is one place con can generate offense, and one place pro needs to be clear in their case construct as far as what they think a moral obligation is and how they meet said obligation. There's a few different ways that people can go with that. The most common is going to be con arguing that countries cannot have moral obligations, which is going to be a hurdle pro needs to overcome in many rounds on this topic. Next, there's this idea of mitigating the effects. It doesn't say to prevent the effects, and it doesn't say to mitigate the causes or to mitigate climate change, just as to mitigate the effects of climate change. So what does it mean to mitigate versus to stop or to adapt to or to prevent? And what does it mean by the effects of climate change as opposed to mitigate climate change itself? Can you have an obligation to mitigate climate change's effects, but not have an obligation to mitigate climate change itself? What is climate change beyond just its effects? Those questions can be answered in a couple different ways. It will also be important as this topic goes on, as far as deciding which contentions belong in your case, which don't, which contentions you think your opponent should be able to access, which they ought not be able to access. So there's a few particular questions that this can bring up on the topic. So, for instance, aside from what constitutes a developed country, do obligations that aren't unique to developed countries count? If there's a moral obligation that all countries have, is that proving the resolution true, or is that outside the scope of the resolution? What if there's an obligation that would be a moral obligation, but there's also practical reasons why it is necessary to do, or reasons why it makes good economic sense to do? Is it still a moral obligation if it is the right thing to do, but the countries aren't doing it for moral reasons? So, do those count as pro-ground, or do they not? Obviously, the question of whether countries can have moral obligations, a question of what is or isn't included in mitigating effects, and this can be infinitely reductive. Anything that I might say, well, that's not an effect of climate change, that's an effect, but it's not the actual climate change. You can take that back as far as you want. Maybe only CO2 is climate change and warming is an effect. Maybe warming is climate change and sea level rise is an effect. Maybe sea level rise is a change in climate, and the reducing crop yields it causes is an effect. So you need to be clear on what effects actually means. And lastly, what are the effects of climate change? The most common is just the idea of global warming, but more dramatic weather patterns can also be an issue. Also note that the resolution says climate change rather than global warming, so even if a con team were to win the Earth is not warming somehow, if the climate is still changing in other ways, there are still plenty of ways that the pro team can win the round. They may not necessarily know what is causing it, and they don't need to necessarily prove causality. They just show that something bad is happening with the climate that developing countries can and ought to do something about. And making it more complicated than that isn't necessarily helpful to either team. So let's take a step back and talk about climate change as a whole. CO2, carbon dioxide, is a greenhouse gas. If I fill 2 glass bottles, one with air and one with half air and CO2, and I put them both in the sunlight, the one with the CO2 is going to get warmer faster. That's really not up for debate. The question is, what effect does this and other emissions have on the world? Does pollution count as climate change? It might. It probably depends on the kind of pollution and how it affects the climate. Warming itself can have many effects, a lot of which are positive feedback loops. That is to say, something which causes itself in a greater degree again and again and again. The most common being ice caps melting and sea level rise with water vapor. So, proponents of this theory say that rises in temperatures cause ice caps to melt. Ice caps melting causes higher sea levels. Higher sea levels causes more water vapor. More water vapor causes higher temperatures causes more ice to melt, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. And that once this is something that's started, then it can't really be stopped. Or you need to take drastic action to stop it. Fortunately, pros are not under an obligation to stop something as much as they are to mitigate it. Because this is not the mitigation versus adaptation topic that was selected, adaptation may well be a subset of mitigation for the purposes of many pro teams on this topic. Con teams may want to argue that because it was a different topic idea that was turned down, adaptation does not count as mitigation and should not be pro-ground. Aside from that, there's questions about whether the Earth itself is actually warming. The surface of the Earth is probably getting warmer. The atmosphere has been getting measurably warmer the past several years. The Earth itself may be cooling on the inside. We may be in a cycle that goes back and forth, There may be a large cooling period coming up sometime in the future. The Earth has always had cycles, even before any kind of industry. There have been ice ages, there have been volcanoes, there have been prolonged winters, there have been very hot periods, so on and so forth. Climate change is not just a function of humans, but the bulk of it discussed in this round probably will be, and there are a lot of effects that it can have, some direct, some indirect. Temperatures, sea levels, crop yields, ocean CO2 saturation, these are probably direct effects. Indirect effects of climate change are probably things like famine, things like water wars, things like resource scarcity, things like refugees, displaced populations. These are effects that are almost definitely moral obligations if countries can have them. Con needs to limit pro to the direct effects, because if pro can talk about indirect effects, the only thing con has left to win is that countries can't have moral obligations, people in the countries do, and con does not want to be forced into that position. So con teams need to make a couple choices early on in the topic. First, they have to decide whether they want to agree with the science that the pro team presents for the purposes of burdening the pro team, I'll talk about that more later, or they want to argue against it and force the pro team to spend half of their speech each round defending the science of climate change, that the effects they're talking about are real, are serious, and do exist. Pro will probably win the bulk of those debates. The evidence is a lot better, a lot easier to spin, and makes a lot of specific attacks on the few objections the con team will have, many of which relies on a small number of paid-off scientists from one family who all peer-review each other's articles. Please don't read the ITSO cards. But pro wants to be able to show collective action problems that developed countries alone can solve, or that developed countries are necessary to be a solution for. Con wants to argue policies specifically and what is wrong with those. So how would pro mitigate the effects, and why are those bad ideas? It's very similar to the September topic in that way. Con wants to be kind of vague talking about their case, and hyper-specific on pro's case. Pro can't have a moral obligation unless they do blank, and here is why doing blank is bad. Again, like September, pro is pretty straightforward. Con has a couple options, but needs to pick one and commit to it. So there's a couple ways to force pro to be specific as con on this topic. Going to look at those in a little bit more detail. So one thing that you can do with con is say that the resolution is to mitigate the effects and not the cause, and they can mitigate the effects in their own borders while still contributing to the causes and exacerbating the effects in developing countries. So the moral obligation is to mitigate the causes, not to mitigate the effects. You have a practical obligation to mitigate the effects, and that's secondary to the moral obligation. If I accidentally go around hitting people with my car, and then I come back around and take them to the hospital, I may be better off taking them to the hospital than not taking them to the hospital, but my obligation was to not hit them with the car in the first place. My moral obligation was to the cause, not to the effects. I may have practical reasons to deal with the effects, but my moral obligation was to limit the cause. And that's one way that con can kind of force pro to deal with this. And what that can do then is, because these effects disproportionately harm the developing countries more than the developed ones, you're arguing that mitigation is just rational selfish interest. For instance, sea levels may rise, we can build a wall on our own beach to mitigate its effects, but we're forgetting about the developing countries, we're just letting them flood. The other thing that I can do is, instead of challenging climate change, agree with it, make it sound more serious, more imminent, and more inevitable than the pro team is, and talk about how, to mitigate its effects, certain things need to be done, and the only ways to do those things are bad or are not worth it. I'm not arguing there wouldn't be a moral obligation in a vacuum. I'm arguing if there are other obligations I can't meet by meeting this obligation, those obligations become less important by proxy. I'll talk about these a little bit more in the second part.